Do a good night story, because I miss you. Can you say that?
Papa, Grandma Judy and Dick, I want to read Goodnight Moon to you. But I can't without that show.
It's fine. Go ahead. You can start. Mommy's video.
Ouch. Good night, brush. Good night, comb. Good night, mush. Good night. Good night, red balloon. Good night of the cow jumping over. Good night. Good night of a picture of the cow jumping over the moon. Good night, three little bears singing on chairs.
Slow it a little bit.
Good night, mittens. Good night, kittens. Good night, little mouse. Good night, toy house. Right. Good night, brush. Good night, comb. Good night, mush. Good night to an old lady whispering hush. She's on the computer.
She's knitting.
She's knitting. Knitting. Good night, mittens. Good night, kittens. Good night, brush. Good night, comb. Good night, mush. Good night. Good night, red balloon. Good night of the cow jumping over the moon.
Good night, room.
Good night, room. And good night to an old lady whispering hush. Wait. Good night, three little bears sitting on chairs.
Oh.
I like the three little bears. Good night, cow jump. Good night, moon coming up. Good night, cow jumping over the moon. Good night, mittens.
Good night, light.
Good night, light. Good night, brush. Good night, comb. Good night, mush. Good night, red balloon. And good night, little toy house.
Bears, yeah. Good night, chairs.
Good night, chairs. And good night, mittens. Good night, kittens. Good night, mittens. Good night, kittens. Good night,
Clocks.
good night, clocks. Good night, brush. Good night, comb. Good night, mush. And good night, mittens. Good night, kittens.
Those are socks, aren't they?
No, not mittens.
I thought this says good night clocks and good night socks.
Good night, little mouse. Good night, toy house. Good night. Good night. No. Good night, brush. Good night, comb. Good night, mush. And good night, mittens. And good night, the bear sitting on side. Good night, nobody. Good night, mush. Good night. Good night, mittens. Good night, kittens. And good night, lady whispering hush. Good night, stars. Good night, air. One more.
Last page.
Good night, noise.
Good night, noises.
Everywhere.
Good night, Grandma and Grandpa.
Good night, Grandpa and Grandma Jody. I love you.
Blow me a kiss. Blow me a kiss.